Hello and welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. This is Pastor Haig and Jeremy, and today we're going to talk about the topic of narcissism. Both Jeremy and I decided to read a book, When Narcissism Comes to Church, written by Chuck DeGroat. The official title is When Narcissism Comes to Church, Healing Your Community from Emotional and Spiritual Abuse. So, Jeremy, as we talk about this broader topic of narcissism, what was your thoughts after you read the book?
Yeah, it was a pretty difficult book to actually listen to it. I did an audiobook take instead of actually reading it. So I listened to it, and it's pretty hard to listen to. There's several things in the book that are revealing just about leadership in general, some really scary stuff about narcissism and how it takes hold of communities. Did you feel the same way? Like it was kind of
It was a
hard,
very
like not hard to get through in the sense of like it was difficult reading, but hard to get to because it was like painful to watch how many people fall into this trap.
It was like you're reading a book about attacking your career and then realizing how common this is within the career you're in.
Mm-hmm.
And our career is one in which we're supposed to be these spiritual leaders. So it was very hard to read, similar because it was so painful to hear example after example of pastors who get into these roles of leadership when they are self-centered.
Right.
The collateral damage that causes is just heartbreaking. And you have it across the board. And one of the main reasons why people do not come to church is because they view it as hypocritical. They view the leaders hypocritical. I mean, you have a lot of megachurch pastors with their financial scams and schemes. This is connected to the Catholic priests, sexual abuse of children. You have people in leadership who are just there for the wrong reasons, and they're just there for self-branding, and they think they're on these power trips and they could abuse innocent people, and it's not across the board. And the scary thing about it is there's like a subtle version of it, and the book also was a self-check too, right?
Right. That's, I think, the value of the book, I think personally for me, was a real self-reflection. I mean, I went into the book thinking about, how to handle because narcissism in any context is really hard to manage and deal with. There's boundary lines you have to draw, and navigating it is really it requires wisdom. And so I went into the book thinking I'm going to read this to help equip me to manage narcissism in private practice and in communities. And I, when I finished reading the book, it was more like, kind of self-checking and diagnosing and like sort of thinking about my own self-tendencies towards this kind of thing. And I think one of the valuable things that the book brought out and emphasized was that, this concept of narcissism is not like a binary, on or off kind of a thing, that there's sort of a spectrum on which you fall, and everybody has some tendency towards this pattern of narcissism. So it was kind of sobering to check yourself on that spectrum and think about where you lie on it. I guess generally, the whole concept of narcissism is rooted, according to the book, in this experience of self-shame, right? This idea that from our limitedness or from our inability to be, what we want to be or create what we want to create, and from that place of shame, we develop these defenses that make us want to be grander than we actually are, or build a world that's more to our liking than is actually in front of us. And then we sort of project that on other people and criticize people who mess with our vision for what we want in the world. And I mean, that's at a very general sense, that kind of running definition of narcissism is present in most of us, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I do believe like at the root of all sin is some form of pride, and narcissism is definitely a manifestation of what pride is. But yeah, so he anchors it more in shame than anything else, which was the nuance to it. But
Yeah.
there's a narcissist story, right? There's this. It's a Greek myth. There's this like alpha male type guy. All the ladies want him. He's a good hunter. He goes in front of a pool, sees his reflection, and the usual interpretation of that, he's just so into himself that he falls into the pool and drowns. Is that the moral of the story? I don't know. I haven't read it. I'm just like,
I haven't read it in a
there are
while,
a million people interpreted that thing.
I think he stares at his face in the river and never leaves, and he
It never
just
leaves.
Yeah, he's stuck in that self-love forever. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. That was a pretty different take on the narcissism or the narcissist story. In the book, he kind of takes it a different direction and says that the whole narcissist's story is rooted not so much in pride. Pride is the secondary emotion, or the secondary, what would you call that? I guess not a virtue, the secondary issue. But at the bottom line is actually shame, and that narcissist wasn't wanting to leave because deep down there's this understanding that he can't keep it up, that he can't always be that person, that alpha male, that 100% all the time. And so out of that place of shame, he stays where he's comfortable, and he rests in that self-love, and never has to deal with disappointment or loss or feeling less than. And so I thought that was an interesting take. He roots that in the Genesis story, if you remember.
Mm-hmm.
That Adam and Eve, their first sin was not pride but shame at their creatureliness and their inability to be God, to receive everything as a gift. That's not something they wanted, and so that pride is actually a masking of deep and profound shame. I thought that was very perceptive.
Yeah, and so when we talk, I feel like shame is really the
Broad.
hardest thing to work with in relationships and counseling, because it prevents people from being honest. It's this putting on of a mask.
Mm-hmm.
And literally not feeling comfortable in one's own skin.
Mm-hmm.
And as I try to counsel people, just like personally, it's just like I'm trying to get people to God, who wants to cover your shame, who wants to give you love. So a large part of it is like the inability to love yourself, right? To have self-worth for who you really are. And it's what I really like is the C.S. Lewis quote where he says, humility, which is like the opposite form of pride here, is not thinking less of yourself, is thinking of yourself less. So,
yeah, that's a good.
So I think we all need to have some sort of sense of self-worth, self-value to us, but we shouldn't be obsessed with the self we have or the false self we project.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, it's I think the thing you mentioned earlier that that shame creates a mask, right? So if you're ashamed of yourself, or you're ashamed of something about your lack of measuring up to something, some standard, then you create a mask to cover that up, right? And that mask is where we get, I mean, the language we could use clinically is like you create a defense mechanism to hide that. But the masks that we kind of wear are almost always to hide some sort of underlying shame that we're afraid to have exposed. I'm not good enough. I'll be found out as a fraud. I have this issue that I deal with, and I don't want anybody to know. And so we compensate with these masks, and narcissism is no exception to that. I mean, that's quite honestly what we do. We create the mask of I have it all together to hide the deeper shame that we experience.
So like everyone struggles with this, right? So it's like there's more of like a spectrum. Uh, like
Yeah, I
so,
think
so yeah.
yeah, I think the idea is that, so like uh, on the one hand, when we talk about somebody being a narcissist or having narcissistic tendencies, we're not identifying that person as you are a narcissist, like that's their whole personhood, but we're describing like a pattern of relationships and behaviors that they display. And those patterns of certain behaviors and relationships and things like that in their personality are on a spectrum. It's not like you're either a narcissist or not. There's just tendencies that play out throughout all of us. Um, and I think that, like we said earlier, all of us display certain tendencies towards being afraid of our shame being exposed. And so therefore puffing up a vision of ourselves that is more grandiose or more together than we would like people to know about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you are currently getting your master's in marriage and family therapy. What is the clinical definition of narcissism? Um,
Yeah. So there's a couple. So the big like diagnostic tool, the assessment tool that most therapists use is this thing called the Diagnostic Statistics Manual. They shorten it to the DSM, and they have different versions of it. And so now the most updated version is the DSM-5. It's the 5th edition. So in that book, there's different, researched diagnostic tools that, say, hey, these are some signs and cautions for specific issues, whatever that might be. And within that, there's this section for personality disorders. And so narcissism falls under this section of personality disorders. And it's just one of a set of personality disorders. There's different subtypes. So there's clusters, they call them. And narcissism falls in this second cluster they call cluster B, where people display dramatic or emotional behavioral patterns. So there's one called histrionic. This one is narcissistic. There's antisocial. So all of these personality sort of disorders are clustered under cluster B. Borderline, I don't know, have you ever heard of maybe borderline personality disorders?
no, what's that?
So I don't want to go off topic, but borderline is probably related to narcissism. All of these cluster B personality disorders are probably connected to each other. In fact, the book made the point that narcissism is kind of the umbrella, and then within those, borderline, histrionic, other personality disorders fall in. But borderline is when you have an individual who, the best way to describe it is they're hot, and then for some reason, out of nowhere, all of a sudden, boom, they're cold. They're like totally infatuated and in love with you, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they want to burn all their bridges with you and tear down the house. So that's borderline personality disorder, and it's probably attached to and connected to narcissism at some level. But back to narcissism and cluster B personality disorders is generally the definition from the manual is a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for admiration, a lack of empathy, and it's supposed to begin early on in adulthood and present throughout a whole variety of different contexts throughout childhood. Throughout adulthood, excuse me. So it's not like, Joe Schmo was really rude to me and thinks he's better than me, at church. That's not a reason to diagnose somebody with narcissistic personality disorder. But if there's a pervasive pattern from adulthood or from early adulthood all the way through in different contexts, at work, at home, in relationships, with, in leisure, all of those things coming together, that's the beginning of a warning light that there is some tendency. So there's narcissistic personality disorder. And there's like several different markers. You're supposed to at least have 5 of those markers. I don't want to go into all of those, but it's all sort of connected to some of the concepts that de Groot was mentioning in the book. It's connected to uh, ideas of early childhood attachment, this concept in psychoanalysis called splitting, which is a defense mechanism, and just generally, this idea, like we talked about, of just being flawed human beings who are in need of love. And if we don't find it, we find other masks to put on us to kind of hide the deep-seated shame that each of us holds.
Yeah. So the thing that disturbed me about the book was I was hoping for more examples of redemption stories of
Yeah,
narcissists and narcissistic leaders to turn around and stop the behavior.
yeah,
There was like maybe a couple. There was more stories of success for people who were victims of narcissistic church cultures, or married to narcissists. But I was hoping for more of them for redemptive purposes. So like, how do we handle narcissists? Like,
yeah. It's a good question. I mean, they're really full-blown, like, pathological, like, mature, developed, concrete narcissist is going to be really hard to reach, because they have so created the wall around themselves that they just do not want anybody in to see the shame. It's a really, really hard, and then and it's hard also because as a individual who puts themselves in the path of that kind of full-blown narcissism, it's toxic, right? I mean,
right,
there's experiences of I mean, dealing with a narcissist can also lead to being the victim of violence. I mean, there are violent tendencies in certain cases of narcissism, and so there's that aspect where you need to really have wisdom in how involved you get. It's one of the things you don't want to do, especially with narcissism, is develop a messiah complex where you think you're going to fix these people, fix this kind of pattern of behavior and
right.
become like the martyr on which their salvation lies. I think the healthy way to approach it within the church, within the Christian tradition, is to recognize that you are a vessel of God's grace, and that you are a part of God's story of tearing down that wall that a narcissist has developed around them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I try to look like I think tough love needs to be given. I mean, I don't claim to be an expert for clinical narcissism here at all, but just in general, when someone is very stubborn in their belief, or their dogma, I think Jesus was dealing with this in the Gospels with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and you could kind of get a glimpse of what he did. Right, he would call them out. He would like call them hypocrites, which means actors. Literally, he's calling the religious clergy of his day to take off their masks.
right.
Stop pretending to be something you're not.
Yeah,
Actually loses his cool and goes after them, and he either would just call them out, but he would also be clever, and tell parables to disarm them, to get them to realize this error of their ways. I think there's
right.
something really powerful in studying the methodology of how Jesus handles characters within his ministry. So
Yeah,
for the sinner and the tax collector, he will show compassion and love. But for the self-righteous leader, he will call them out and also indirectly communicate with parables. And I think those are important tools to keep in mind.
yeah.
But again, I haven't really dealt personally with a full blown narcissist that's been diagnosed, to my knowledge. I probably have, but I
That's
wonder.
another
Yeah,
that's another aspect too, is that most of it goes undiagnosed because you don't see a full-blown narcissist going to therapy. um a fully developed manifestation of narcissism means you don't need, the person would imagine that they don't need any help, everybody else needs help. So you will, and it's referenced in the book, data will show that you're more likely to see it in the context of a couple, where the wife or the husband brings in the narcissist because they're fed up with dealing with it.
right.
So like an individual who's a narcissist doesn't typically want to come to counseling because they don't want the shame to be exposed, and B, they don't think they need to be fixed. So that's, so you're very right. You might see this all over the place with people who just aren't diagnosed. that might be the case.
Yeah.
The other thing is just back to taking the tough love approach. That works, and it's definitely a potential way to interact with counseling an individual with narcissism. But the thing that you have to balance it with is very likely it's not very well researched, but it's very possible, and it's a way that I like to think and conceptualize narcissism, that the problem, the source of the narcissistic behavior patterns comes from what we call early attachment. So like everybody is born into the world. Everybody has a caregiver. It doesn't necessarily end up being a parent, but most people have some caregiver. And the concept is, it was back in I think it was the 50s, there's a guy named John Bowlby who developed this theory of attachment, where when you're born into the world, your caregiver becomes the first person that you experience love from. And so the first person that you are attached to and that you receive care from, that you ideally feel secure and safe around. And then your adult relationships become a projection of that early attachment. So I learned how to love and care for others based on how I was loved and cared for as a child. That's sort of the general rough and cut description of attachment theory. So in the context of narcissism, the idea is possibly that in that early attachment process, you experienced abuse or shame or guilt, in some sense, that made you feel like you weren't good enough. And so as in a way to adjust and sort of develop an ability to engage in the world, you inflated yourself and became, sort of a grandiose character, so that you wouldn't have to deal with the hurt and the pain of that shame and the hurt and the pain of that abuse or whatever poor attachment you had early on in childhood. So if that's the case, full circle, when you do the tough love thing, all they see is the parent from early on who criticized them and abused them. And that becomes one more reason for them to blow up the grandiose character and attack you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So unless there's a context for, I'm here for your help, I'm here for your support, I love you, there has to be some context of, this is a safe attachment, and the criticism that's coming is because I really think you need to put these patterns to rest. That won't help. That will probably trigger them to actually attack you even more.
Yeah,
it's dangerous.
Yeah. I was watching the Michael Jordan documentary, The Last Dance, and the last
I haven't seen it yet. Was that good?
It's really good. It's still going on. There's 10 episodes.
Oh man, I gotta watch that.
6 talks about his leadership style, Michael Jordan's,
Mm-hmm.
and he would literally trash talk his teammates, give them the tough love, to the extreme, because he really wants to win.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing that approach does not work. Most millennials will collapse under that pressure. They'll just be like, "Oh no, Michael Jordan's being mean to me." But
yeah.
Of course, it's circumstantial, but I do think that's the tricky thing too, right? You have to figure out where is this really coming from. Will they react like in this situation? But sometimes I think the tough love is necessary to wake people up from their stubbornness. Yeah. But I totally get what you're saying, and I do not claim to be an expert on this topic.
Well, that's why it becomes so hard to treat, because again, they don't, unless a narcissist will not come to ask for advice or treatment. They won't want the tough love from you because they don't think there's anything to learn. And as soon as you tell them there is something to learn, they'll say, "You're stupid. I know what's best." And, just quiet down. So it really does depend on having the relationship and context for that. Now, the question then becomes, if you just are always doing the groundwork for seeding a relationship of safety and security and love, are you becoming an enabler? That's the other side of the story. And then that's the scary thing.
Yeah, that's the other extreme. Yeah.
So I think we've been talking about the extreme cases. I mean, these are what we're talking about is cases that would be dangerous or worrisome. And if you saw this, you'd feel a sense of like, I don't feel comfortable around that person. But maybe if we tone it down to something that we might see a little bit more often, like in your world, like what do you think when in counseling, like what are more tempered, along that gradient, that scale that we talked about? People aren't just extreme or non-existent narcissists. Like what are the more moderate expressions of narcissism that we even see in ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about the book was there was a whole chapter dedicated to the culture of narcissism, how like the church
Mm,
culture sets up these sort of people to be cultivated in. And we definitely live in a narcissistic culture with like social media, with Instagram, with appearance. I think there was this study, I don't know the exact statistics, but pretty much they interviewed a group of middle schoolers, and it was recent. I don't know the exact date or the exact numbers, but pretty much more middle schoolers wanted to be an Instagram celebrity versus a doctor.
mm,
So like what we prioritize in our culture is just there. Especially we live in a very individualistic culture. On top of it, that kind of creates more of this
yeah.
grandiose me. I'm all in this to for myself. So it's definitely there. And as like a pastor, I think the three biggest enemies that I go after when it comes to just helping people is shame, is pride, and fear. And they're all connected. Because there's definitely shame, people not feeling comfortable in their own skin. And usually pride and fear get in the way of people tackling their shame.
Hmm.
Right? Like I'm just they're so proud that they
Hmm.
don't believe there is shame, or they're not comfortable or they're in their skin, or they're so aware of their shame that they're too scared to attack it.
Yeah.
And for me, just like reflecting on what Kierkegaard says, he says pride and cowardice or fear are two sides of the same coin.
Hmm.
Pride says, I don't need help. I could do this on my own. I'm good. And fear says, I'm not good enough to take care of this. I'm not good enough to find an answer to this.
Hmm.
It's never going to go away.
Yeah.
And the both interesting thing about pride and fear is there's this emphasis on the self. And like going
Right.
back to what C.S. Lewis says, humility, which I think is the key to get to the point of addressing your shame, is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. Pride and fear, you think a lot about yourself. The attention's on yourself. So as a pastor, the main goal is to get the attention off of yourself and onto God. And then in finding your identity in Christ, knowing that he has covered our shame with forgiveness, and we're connected to the one who made us so we could
Right.
be ourselves. There is the unraveling of a lot of different types of illnesses or mental understandings. And it creates this like understanding that we are connected to the one who made us. I could be comfortable in my own skin. Yes, I may have a history. Yes, my ancestors may have done stuff, but I am forgiven and loved by the one who made me. And
Yeah.
finding my identity in that is the most freeing thing. But
Yeah.
getting people to that point of surrender and faith that destroys the shame, pride and fear often get in the way.
That's huge. Yeah. I mean, just a couple of things to riff off from what you just said. I mean, like, so pride and fear, if they're the same coin, then the coin is shame, right? Like, I think that's probably a good way to conceptualize it, that pride and fear are kind of, they go together. I'm proud and I'm afraid of others to, to find out and discover that I'm not all that. And the whole coin together is shame, right? So I don't want anybody to be privy to my shame and what I have underneath the radar. It strikes me, you made an interesting point about social media. It strikes me if we also kind of use that metaphor of putting on a mask, that there is that self that I'm ashamed of. Um, and now with social media, we have this fantastic tool that becomes this like instant shield to mask my insecurities, right? And so there's almost like an enabling of this narcissistic pattern that that social media has allowed. I mean, there's good things about social media too, but one kind of pathology connected to it is that we present a self that is not ourself.
Right.
We present a much better version, a grandiose version, using the DSM language that isn't really who we are. And
Literally an edited version of ourselves.
exactly. Nobody looks that good all the time.
Yeah.
Like, these people who are like off on vacation 24/7, like, it's this whole, carefully curated, manufactured vision of myself. And we have a tool to go at that and do that now. And so it isn't a mistake that we have a system that perpetuates narcissistic patterns of behavior in our culture. But I'd go even deeper and criticize just the church in general. In a lot of our evangelical circles, we create a system in which we have a very sanitized version of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And we come to church and just pretend like everything's okay and nothing is wrong, and just kind of go about life as if the self that we project at church is the one, right? And there's no willing to confess or recognize fault and recognize insecurity and recognize the fact that we're creatures, right? Like, we're made by God for love. And if we don't fess up to the reality that that grace is the way forward, then I mean, we're also perpetuating a system in our churches that is narcissistic.
So I think you touched upon it. Like, if we can't be honest, right? If you can't be honest about your weaknesses, your sins, your shortcomings, your shame,
you're contributing to the problem.
You're contributing to the problem. And churches could be the fakest places because there's this false expectation that everything is in order. But if we're really Christian, the whole point is to acknowledge nothing is in order. We need grace. We need help. But you can't access the grace until you're honest.
Yeah. And I think
and like, I often say this a lot because we really stress out just being confessional and creating systems of accountability at my church.
Yeah.
And we've lost that in the Protestant world. We have to be people who confess sin regularly and or hold each other accountable. But oftentimes people think that in the act of confessing, they're going to increase their shame.
Right.
But the beautiful thing about what I love to do is when people confess their sins to Christ, shame gets broken. There's freedom. There's actual love. God actually doesn't want you to live in shame. He loves you. And it's one of the most beautiful things to witness, the love of God and knowing that there's this freedom on the other side of confession.
Right.
In a breaking of shame, not an increase of shame.
Right.
But yeah.
No, I was going to say, I think that one of the points the book was making, and that I think is a really scary, profound point for most of our churches, but I think by creating a system of churches that are sort of fake and not recognizing that those realities, those deeper shame selves are kind of hidden, is that fake church kind of system creates an environment where the pastor becomes the symptom bearer. Yeah. Like, in other words, they become the focus of all of the symptoms of the fakeness and everything. The lack of accountability, the lack of presenting a self that is maybe afraid and ashamed a little bit at times. And so a lot of the controversies that you see in our evangelical circles, I mean, how many different like crises can we could just go down a list of them. I don't want to do that now because it'd be depressing, but there's so many leadership failures in Christian circles and historically in the church in general. And I think that a lot of that roots back to this, again, this facade, this wall that we mask, and leaders being in those positions become the ones who are the focus. They become like the figureheads of that symptomology, that pathology.
Yeah. I was thinking a lot about the fine line between narcissistic behavior and strong leadership.
Yeah.
It's tough to discern that there's things with motive in place. Like Michael Jordan, for example, he was the alpha male on the court. He's the best. His motive was to motivate people to win, and he won.
Yeah.
Is that like, will someone view that as, is this guy egotistical, or is this guy just passionate and is just getting the job done as a good leader?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard to discern, and that goes to the pastor too, right? They're trying to push people in uncomfortable situations to get the job done. So I think a lot depends on the motive and the methodology too. But that I was thinking that about a lot, because sometimes it could be just, could be just good leadership.
Right. And sometimes the motive could be a mask for deeper narcissistic tendencies. So it's a dangerous thing. There's a great book. I'm going to butcher the title, but it was one of my favorite books in seminary, written by a professor. So shout out to Gary McIntosh. I think you read a bunch of McIntosh's books.
Yep.
Didn't you, for your leadership, your doctor ministry?
Just one.
Oh, okay. Anyway,
yep.
He wrote a book called The Dark Side of Leadership. It's one of my favorite books from the class that he taught. And its basic thesis is every strength you have as a leader has the potential to go dark and become like just a total ministry killer.
Right.
So an example is, you're a really great administrator. You do everything really well administratively. You've got all your ducks in a line, but you could flip that, and the dark side could be you go the extreme and you just kill everything with agendas, with like everything has to be run by you. You micromanage everything, and that just kills a ministry. It kills the spirit of a community. So I think that's one way to think about what we're talking about. There is a quality in leaders that pushes, that casts vision, that moves forward, but there's that dark side where there's a turn you take where it could become predatory, really. And I think what you say, motive, is a good way to talk about it, but I think what might be the in is whether that vision and that pushing is for the betterment of others, or when you start to use others for your own vision and your own self accomplishment. Using others rather than loving others is typically the switch for pathology in my mind. When you start using people so they fill your ego and your purpose and your vision, that's when you're running the line of really just destroying your ministry and buying into a brokenness that will not have any life in the future.
Yeah. So motive and whether you're loving or manipulating are
right. I mean, I think at the bottom line of all of this, I mean, so one thing I want to drive home is that everybody has a personality disorder.
Right.
Like everybody has some personality flaw in them. If you ever have a really if you ever have trouble falling asleep, go read the DSM-5, and there's a list of those personality disorders from cluster A, B, and C. And if you read those, you'll find things that sound like you sometimes.
It's like playing Dr. MD, like I have a cough, but
right, exactly. It's like, yeah,
really severe.
Right, exactly. So everybody has a personality disorder, and the reason is we all had parents who were human beings, right? Like we all had parents who were flawed, who loved us to the best of our ability, the best of their ability, but had mistakes that they made. So there's actually a thing, and this is the actual word for it in the clinical world and theory: good enough parenting. Like we had good enough parents. Like most of us had parents who did their best, loved us, cared for us, and did but there were certain flaws that they had, and we developed self-soothing mechanisms, defense mechanisms, ways to adjust so that we didn't feel shame and guilt all the time. So all of us has some sort of personality disorder, which is why we talk about a spectrum rather than an on or off.
Yeah. And it's funny because it's like, well, happy Mother's Day to everyone out there.
Yeah, right.
but the most common way people got into fights on the playground is you talk about someone's mom.
That's right. You go after them.
You go after them, man. You make fun of my mom, or you're done.
Right.
But and I also find that like one of the main ways to help people too is to acknowledge where is this coming from. Like, and I also believe that we need to confess the sins of our ancestor too. But there's sometimes difficulty in people being honest about talking about their parents who they love, and they love them. But good enough parenting is good enough. I always try to tell people that, look, you're honoring your parents by destroying the destructive behaviors that may have been passed down to them.
Right.
By being honest that they exist, bringing them into the light, and making the decision to break those patterns.
Right.
but it goes back to this mask, right? Especially in like Eastern cultures, Armenian culture, we cannot talk bad about our parents, but
Right.
or assume that if I'm talking bad about someone, that means I don't love them.
Right.
These are
Right.
challenges of honesty and actually going at the issues, because
Right.
there's this shame layers that are just there.
Right. And there's, so the point that I was getting to is that it's all rooted in your experience of love at the very beginning. Right. And so if love and attachment and connection and safety and security was there for you as a child in a good enough sense, then you learn how to manage those things moving forward. If it wasn't, then that becomes that becomes an area that you lean into and you talk about, because that could be where some of the, more extreme manifestations of some of these personality disorders might surface. But if love is the early foundational part of it, then love will be the future foundation for securing and healing and maintaining a more robust relationship with God and one another. So love is really the very basic foundation. I mean, it's wild because research on that concept of attachment, which is really just talking about love and security as a childhood, that language of attachment has been researched, I mean, like across cultures, and is found to be like significantly valid. So it's like love is this thing that transcends all these cultures, and secure, I mean, whatever manifestation of love looks like in those different cultures, because it's all different, but whatever love is in that context and culture, when you receive it at a young age among your parents, then it develops into, managing some of those things better in the future. So I guess I'm starting to like, diverge from the point here, but the point, I'm trying to make is that really like love will be the beginning of the answer to whatever healing needs to take place moving forward. Love from God and love from one another.
Yeah, but you're not talking about like the emotion of love here. You're talking about acts of love, sacrifice, providing that security, the focus on the other.
I'm
Because
talking about both.
I'm not, yeah, but there's both end. But oftentimes I feel like sometimes our understanding of love could be too cliche, right? And part of the culture we live in creates that cliche to love, where it's like this 3-minute pop song or this 1 hour, 40-minute rom-com.
Right.
But I assume the love you're talking about is going to be the love of what is found in scripture, who God is, this like otherness, giving without expecting anything in return.
It's the love that would be willing to deal with a narcissist, right?
Right.
Because an unloving response to that would be, screw you, I don't care. Like, I don't want to deal with this violent, toxic individual, get him out of my life. Which, you have to create boundaries and, be able to set that aside. But, the love that actually desires to find a better way for people who are struggling with these issues, a love that's willing to create a safe space where they can talk about it, and then offer them insight onto how to help adjust it, and so, yeah, I mean, love, not in the sense of like, yeah, you're cool, you're happy, like yeah, that's not really love. That's just, cliches and
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think like innately with this understanding of love, honesty has to be part of the picture. There has to be truth to it. Truth without love is dangerous. Love without truth is also dangerous. They come in a package, and you can't help anyone unless there's love or truth, honesty and companionship. And that goes across the board for any sort of thing. And we all have something we need to work on, but if we can't fix it unless we work with each other and there's love there and honesty, and then there's specific methodologies depending on what you're dealing with, where these things came from. But yeah, so if we don't do this, we end up fueling the problem of narcissism, like you said, right? Like
Yeah.
we're like, nope, it's not my job to love other people.
Mm-hmm.
I only need to care about myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the definition in the New Testament of love is always reference to Jesus and to his life, his ministry, his death, and his resurrection. So whenever the New Testament talks about love, it's a reference to God's self-giving for his enemies, his giving of himself over to even his enemies to the point of death. So it's this self-sacrificing love that's willing to put yourself on the line, to be vulnerable. Now, again, the dangerous thing of interacting with the really extreme cases of narcissism is that you'll find you put yourself out to be vulnerable and you get taken advantage of. And so there's wisdom to that, where you don't want to be enabling the pattern of behavior. You want to be doing it wisely so that you know, are actually helping and loving rather than just becoming an enabler to perpetuate that pattern of hurt.
Right. That's where the truth piece comes in.
Right.
And the creating the boundary is actually the loving act versus being taken advantage of, which is so important too.
Yeah.
And so there needs to be that delicate balance. But yeah, this is very insightful conversation, Jeremy. I look forward to learning from you as you continue to finish your master's. And for any viewers who are listening to this, feel free to comment, share your advice, share some resources on the comment link. We'd love to learn more, and we all need each other at the end of the day. Let's learn from each other. Let's love each other, so we don't get so full of ourselves to the point where we think the world is all about us, and that's just a complete lie. We need to be honest, and we need to be willing to be vulnerable at the end of the day. Vulnerability is being honest and with the intention of wanting to get help. So these are just principles, I think, that apply for any sort of thing we're all dealing with. But yeah, this book we read was When Narcissism Comes to Church. It was an interesting read. It's focused on narcissism in church leadership in specific, but it also applies in general for all types of careers. Any final thoughts, Jeremy? Any sort of closing remarks as we wrap up this conversation?
No, I think you hit it all on the head. I think the book is a good read if you're willing to do some self-reflection and think about your own patterns in the same light. And yeah, it did skew towards leadership, but it was also talking about church being the place where you where you see narcissism sort of feel at home at times because of, like we talked about, that sort of fakeness and that refusal to actually see one another on a deeper level, on a confessional level. So I think it would be a good read for lay leaders as well. If at the very least it is to kind of do some own self-reflection too. Maybe we can put the little link to the book underneath in the comment page, or on the comment link underneath the podcast when we post it.
Yeah, and maybe in a future episode we'll get the author to come on the program.
Yeah, that would be great.
Cool. Thank you for watching, everyone. Stay caffeinated, and remember, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less. And so have self-worth, but also focus on other people. It's the cure. It's love. Anyway, that was me and my pastor. We're trying to wrap things in a nice bow tie.
Your hike pastor corner.
Yeah, but with the reality, this is really messy. And we.
Yeah.
All right, everyone, stay caffeinated. I'm done with my cup of coffee. All right,
yeah,
take care.
I am too. Take it easy.